Welcome, everyone. We're going to be this morning speaking about the future of environmental assessments. What are the factors influencing environmental studies and how are these impacting projects? This is hosted by Waterfront, and my name is Rufus Howard. I am the IEMA policy lead for impact assessment. That's the Institute of Environmental Management Assessment, and I'll be facilitating and chairing today. So we've got two guest panelists, Rob Garden and Josh Fothergill, who I'll introduce in a moment. And together we're going to be having a few opening statements followed by an audience Q&A talking about the future of environmental assessment and latest developments around case law, direction of travel for environmental assessment, topics such as proportionality, perhaps touching on transition to environmental outcome reports or other reforms. So as I go through this, please do fire in questions using the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and so I'll pick them up. Before we go into that Q&A, I'm going to welcome our two panelists. So to start, we have Rob Garden. He's partner at CMS in their planning team in London. Rob has a specialism in energy and infrastructure projects. He joined CMS in 2010 and has trained with the firm and has particular experience in consenting energy projects, particularly around development consent orders and compulsory purchase orders. Rob also provides strategic advice through the development process, including obtaining and optimizing consents, and has depth of experience in environmental impact assessment, habitats regulation assessment. And he's currently promoting a number of hydrogen projects and has recently advised on national policy statements around hydrogen and contributed to Renewable UK's planning for onshore green hydrogen report. So welcome, Rob, and I invite you to start with a few opening remarks before we hear Josh's and then move on to the Q&A.
Thanks, Rufus, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk through Finch primarily in some of the cases that have followed on the back of that. It's not all that often that planning and environmental law are front page news or on the 6 o'clock news, but Finch was probably rightly one of those cases. And by way of a reminder, the decision under challenge in Finch was the decision by Surrey County Council to grant planning permission to retain and expand an oil drill site. Essentially, the ground of challenge in Finch was that the council had failed to comply with obligations in the EIA regulations and failed to assess the combustion emissions, what have been called the indirect effects or the downstream effects of the project. And the decision of the Supreme Court by a majority of 3-2 after alternative decisions in the High Court and the Court of Appeal was that the downstream impacts of greenhouse gas emissions should have been assessed and were within the scope of the regulations. Now, the background to this is obviously that under the EIA regulations, decision makers must take a reasoned conclusion on the significant effects of the proposed development, taking into account the assessments in the environmental statement. And there are two key points that I want to drill into from the decision. The first of those is causation. Now, in Finch, it was called the inevitable outcome, so the downstream effects were inevitable. But causation is going to be a key issue for projects moving forward. And effectively, that's a question of what are or are not the effects of the project. And the court found that that's a question of law, not planning judgment, as has been found in some of the previous courts. And that means that it's open for the court to consider. Now, in Finch, all of the parties had effectively agreed that the downstream effects, the burning of the oil, was an inevitable outcome. So the court didn't have to deal with what the actual test for causation was, but it put forward 3 potential tests. The weakest of those is the but-for test, i.e. but for the development, would the indirect downstream effects happen? The highest bar test is effectively linking it to sufficiency. So what was the development both necessary and sufficient to cause those effects? And the third test is somewhere in the middle, which is effectively, is there any intervening act which is out of the ordinary, which breaks that causal link? I think that leaves some scope for challenge on causation and potentially for some future judicial reviews around what the correct test may be. But ultimately, what the Supreme Court judgment does is recognise that even if there are several steps between a development and an effect, that doesn't mean the impact does not need to be assessed. And instead, the question is whether the effect is caused by that development. So taking Finch, the fact that there was an intermediary step of refinement, that's an ordinary process that doesn't break the causal link. So in spite of the fact there's something in the middle, you still have to assess those effects. Now, the judgment does draw a distinction between certain forms of development, fossil fuel development and other types of projects where the impact, the cause and effect may be less clear. But the crucial approach, I think, for all projects moving forward is to really test that causal link between anything downstream. And the second key point is evidence. There's obviously got to be an ability to quantify and assess the effects in an evidence-based manner as part of the environmental statement. And whilst the test of causation is a matter of law, the court found that this is effectively a matter of planning judgment, i.e. the decision maker can assess the effects and reach their conclusion based on the environmental statement. Now, why Finch reached the decision that they did in the Supreme Court was effectively that it was common ground that there were these effects and they hadn't been assessed. So that planning judgment just hadn't been exercised in this case. So I think both of those areas will be potential future challenges and things to focus on for projects. In terms of the effects of Finch and what we're seeing already, that's being felt across projects. And we've already had another oil drilling site in Lincolnshire where the government conceded to judgment effectively on the same grounds as Finch for a failure to assess downstream effects. And on Friday, we probably had the highest profile fallout so far, which was the Cumbrian coal mine case in Whitehaven. So the High Court handing down judgment on Friday and quashing the decision to grant planning permission there. And one of the more interesting elements, I think, that came out of that was the idea of substitution. And this was something that the developer had posited, that effectively the coal which is being extracted in the UK is substituting coal that would be extracted elsewhere, in this case in the US, so that there's almost a neutral or an offsetting effect between the two. Now, the court dealt with this, and there's quite a useful judgment I'll just read out, but they effectively said that the developer, in order for the developer to claim that this substitution effect would be just as large and that there'd be no net increase in greenhouse gas emissions downstream, or that there would be a lesser offsetting effect, it's for the developer to produce that information in its environmental statement to demonstrate the point, and to demonstrate legal causation in relation to substitution. So again, causation and assessment is key in this judgment. And the court again found that the burning of coal is inevitable. The legal causation between that and the downstream greenhouse gas emissions was established, but there was no finding by the inspector or the Secretary of State on the effects of that, or on legal causation in relation to substitution to justify the decision. So ultimately, the challenge was upheld and the decision quashed. We've also got going on through the Scottish courts the Government and North Sea Transition Authority's decision to grant development for Rosebank and Jackdaw, so 2 oil and gas fields. And they're both subject to further challenges, which the government has already said it will not defend, but which the promoters are still participating in. So we may have more guidance from the Scottish court shortly. And the government has also taken what's a relatively unusual step off the back of case law, the step to confirm that it's going to issue consultation on guidance in the future in order to address the Supreme Court's ruling in Finch. Now, the government's announcement was focused towards oil and gas, but I think there'll be wider application to that for practitioners to be aware of once that comes out. And we're expecting the consultation shortly, and for that to conclude in spring of next year. So I guess the question is, what does Finch and this kind of line of case law mean for projects? And I think the key thing is that the outcome in Finch and Whitehaven is not confined to oil and gas or coal, and I think it does have wider application to projects. And that's recognised in the Finch judgment, where one of the judges, Lord Leggett, referred to Commission guidance, which talks about aggregates and potential road building and the causal link there between the extraction of aggregates and their end use in road building. Now, the judgment does also make some distinctions. So, for instance, manufacturing, where you're potentially manufacturing a small component of a larger process, or where you're producing steel and the end use of that steel may not be known, then it may become impossible to identify what the downstream effects actually are. So for projects, I think the key thing here is ultimately identifying what the end use will be. So if you are a promoter of a steel project, if you are promoting manufacture, understanding what the end use of that will be and whether you can actually identify a causal link and undertake a meaningful assessment of any downstream effects is important. But ultimately, Finch doesn't mean that you can't get planning permission for these projects. And the environmental statement process is effectively an assessment process. Obviously, you can come out with significant adverse effects and still secure planning permission for projects. That will be one factor which is weighed in the balance in decision making, and a key thing, and that will be demonstrating benefits to projects as they come forward. But it clearly puts another challenge in front of projects. And on that line, Finch need not necessarily be seen as a negative. So given the decarbonisation agenda, for example, indirect effects of a project may well be positive effects. So you could be talking about decarbonising industry or a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, again, presenting that in a positive light in the environmental statement will be important. In terms of actually the EIA process, I think it shines a light more on scoping. I think for projects that are still at the pre-application stage, scoping what are those indirect effects will be important. And scoping can obviously be used to scope in and out matters, but it can also be used to fix methodologies. And I think that will be a key issue when you think about indirect effects. Now, again, one of the things that came out from Finch is that effectively there was agreement from all parties that it is possible to assess those downstream greenhouse gas emissions because you've got the IEMA guidance that sets out how to do that and how to quantify the impact of hydrocarbons. Now, that won't always be the case, so using scoping to agree a methodology will be appropriate. And there are still those projects I'm sure people on the line are dealing with, and we're certainly seeing that have gone through. Scoping may well be in the decision-making process. And I think to the extent it's not been challenged already, I think you need to be prepared for either objectors or decision makers to be questioning the projects and the outcomes of Finch. So you may see an uptick in requests for further information or proactively actually kind of submitting addendums or further statements to the environmental statement to supplement this. And ultimately, that's going to be probably a timetabling issue as much as anything for clients in terms of reaching agreement and being able to assess those effects. But what I would say is the Finch litigation started with a grant of planning permission in 2018. So what may seem painful now in terms of getting it right is probably less so than going through the court process and judicial review. I know Josh is going to come on to this, but I'll just touch briefly on a couple of other factors that kind of came out of the Finch case and some of the other cases, the Whitehaven case. The reiteration of public participation and the responsibility for the ES is key, and both cases touch on this, that it's probably obvious for everyone on the call, but it is the responsibility of us as practitioners for developers to produce the environmental statement and make sure this assessment is undertaken. And public participation has been a key factor in both decisions. So ensuring that there's sufficient information for the public to actually participate in the ES process has been key. And then some probably unintended fallout, but things that need to be thought about around proportionality. There's obviously no concept that an effect can't be assessed by more than one project. And I think that's potentially likely now, that particularly where you see clusters of development coming forward or development in being promoted by various different promoters in terms of a chain of consent, having environmental statements that effectively are assessing the same impacts may well increase. So probably a need for developers to talk to each other more there, but also to consider how that can be dealt with proportionally. So a lot to take away. Rufus, I'll hand back to you now. I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you, Rob. Loads of interesting stuff there. I'm sure we can get into that in the discussion. So I'll move us along so that we can then get onto that Q&A. I'm just going to introduce Josh now. So Josh is the founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting. Josh has been a leading expert in environmental assessment field for many years. Some of his highlights include creating the UK's EIA quality mark via IEMA during 2011. He was the lead author of the UK 2017 Proportionate EIA Strategy. He's led international reviews of digital IA and EIA professional recognition in linking the circular economy to environmental assessment practice. Josh founded Fothergill Training and Consulting in 2017, and he specializes in enhancing the effectiveness of environmental assessment through both capacity building, intelligent client roles, and advisory reviews. Josh recently completed a 4-year program with Northern Ireland's Department for Infrastructure Upskilling the planning system around EIA and environmental governance, including playing a critical role in their new EIA screening and scoping practice notes. Welcome, Josh. And yeah, looking forward to hearing your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Rufus, for that. And yeah, congratulations to IMA. I think recently this week, 25 years old. So I saw that on LinkedIn. So that's very cool as a fellow of the Institute, although obviously not a fellow for quite that long. So let me just share my screen. I've got a few slides to just kind of structure what I'm going to talk about. So hopefully you can see those. Am I sharing the right screen? Yep. Okay, very good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we're discussing this morning, the future of environmental assessment, but look at progress that's been made around proportionate EIA practice. So when we're thinking about, what is needed in relation to support the future of environmental assessment and how do we ensure proportionality, we need to be considering, well, what does that mean? And through 2015, 2016, IMA did quite a lot of studies and came up with the document you see on screen, this proportionate EIA strategy for the UK. So I was late drafted in to join this call, so I felt it might be quite useful to do a little bit of a retrospective in terms of, well, where are we now in relation to practice and how do these priorities stack up in relation to practice in 2024 rather than 2017, and to consider, well, how have we made progress on these, and are we doing enough in order to move practice forward? So it's going to be a little bit of a personal take across these 4 kind of key themes: enhancing people, improving scoping, sharing responsibility for more proportionate assessment in practice, and then this move towards innovation and digital. So in relation to enhancing people, it was about recognizing that those involved in the EIA process need to have the skills, the knowledge, and particularly the confidence to avoid an overly precautionary approach. And as Rufus mentioned in the kind of intro to me, I've been working over in Northern Ireland, or had been working over in Northern Ireland with the Department for Infrastructure, in particular with the local authorities, and then in the second phase also with the statutory consultees to really improve the understanding of planning officers and statutory consultees as to what the role of EIA was, what the different processes were, where responsibilities lie, and to give confidence to step in and do those activities. And we're seeing local authorities be more proactive now in terms of their screening approach, in terms of making judgments, in terms of raising questions about different issues, in terms of being kind of engaged with what's going on in case law, like Rob was talking about, and that's great to see. And you can see there just a few of the different organisations that I've trained over the last kind of 5 years. So I definitely say looking at where practice is as opposed to where it was in 2017, the scale of interest and probably to a degree the investment in EIA related training and capacity building has increased. Certainly what I've seen is more developers having EIA related staff in-house and those with knowledge and wanting to have their own understanding of the process and how they fit into that. So that's a positive. But one of the challenges I definitely see is a lack of local authority training. So quite a bit of statutory consultee training, although perhaps a little bit patchy, but certainly a lack of local authority, kind of consistent training across local authorities, which obviously makes a real challenge when we're outside the DCO and NSIP process, because it's those local authorities that are running the screening, the scoping, and other activities. So significant challenges still remain, I think, in relation to skills and remaining in relation to fully understanding the purpose of EIA, keeping up to date with the case law that Rob has just talked about, as well as good practice. And resourcing, I think, is probably something that, in fact, has probably got worse, if not since 2017. In 2017, we were looking forward and seeing the beginning of this big green and sustainability transition. We're now in the middle of it. There are a huge amount of projects coming forward. Developers have started building EIA skills within them. There are more opportunities for sustainability people on projects that aren't necessarily just EIA. So I'm seeing, quite a lot of early career with lots of competition, and even on the senior side of things, struggling to get quality professionals. So certainly that challenge of enhancing people remains. Now, the next area was all about improving scoping to generate a more consistent, focused approach to this critical activity. And obviously, Rob highlighting in relation to Finch and the more recent case that there is this criticality around looking at indirect effects and thinking about causation within this process. So what have I seen over the last 7 years? What are we beginning to see moving forward? Well, there is an increased emphasis, I think, on scoping and recognizing the value of scoping and trying to get it right, engaging the right people at the right time and putting more resource into that stage. So that's great to see. But inevitably, there's a certain amount of hamstrongness in the system when we look back to what I was just talking about in terms of skills and resource availability. So if the statutory consultees or the consenting authority aren't available to engage and discuss the methods needed at the right time, then that can have a real challenge. And inevitably, the developer's EIA team with legal advice need to make decisions and move forward, but inevitably they're always, to an extent, certainly moving forward with program risk in case at a later stage when the consultees can engage, they bring up other issues or question methodologies. What we are seeing is some new and updated guidance. So what you can see on the screen there is Northern Ireland's Development Management Practice Note 9C. It isn't out yet, but I believe it's coming out in the next week or so from the Department for Infrastructure, and that will complement the screening guides that came out last December and the unauthorised EIA guidance that came out a couple of years before that. So quite strong new guidance coming out and advice from the centre in Northern Ireland. Not quite so much movement more widely. We're constantly seeing practice move forward. So there's some interesting JNCC advice and research came out on marine development plans and cumulative effects before the summer. And it's also worth noting that the Planning Inspectorate is going through a refresh of all its DCO NCIP guidance. So the EIA one's scheduled for the back end of this year. So not sure how significant those changes are going to be, whether they're just going to be tinkering or not, but we will see some updates to those. So worth keeping an eye out for all of that. And you can just see on the screen there a kind of key diagram from the Northern Ireland guidance that recognises that proportionally scoping an EIA isn't just about avoiding too much information, but also about avoiding gaps as well. So it is a balance, and that's going to change between the different topics. And as Rob was highlighting, we need to keep ourselves cognizant of changes in practice, changes in case law as to what needs to be discussed in that process and who is available to discuss that. So is there need for further direction? Possibly. Some government steer in relation to this? Well, it would be great if we could do some evidence-based research and something that Rufus was doing a number of years ago for the offshore sector of trying to say, well, what have been the key factors? What have been significant? And in the training that I deliver, it's quite often I'll sit down with people and say, okay, what are the common issues in relation to your sector? And they'll be able to fire out, kind of 10 to 15 topic chapters very, very quickly. Right, fine. How many of these have you done? Oh, we've done 5, we've done 10. Brilliant. Which of those were found to be significant and which of those were found to be significant after mitigation had been applied as residual? That's when everything slows down and the answers become much slower and harder. But we have that information out there. So improving scoping is possible, but we need to get into some other data and feed that back into the process. And some of that is only achievable at a grander scale. So if you're a renewable energy developer, you may have done a number of onshore wind farms, but the industry more widely will have done many, many more. So you can do some of your own analysis, but ideally we need a broader application. 2017 strategy recognised that in order to make proportionate EIA more deliverable, there's a certain amount we can do on a project, but what we really need to do to change practice is to all come together. The statutory consultees, the decision makers, the developers, and various other parties as well, to agree a shared goal in moving forwards. And I'm hopeful, although we haven't seen a huge amount of progress as yet, that the new government will be more willing to engage in these kind of conversations, like we've seen more progress in Scotland, in Northern Ireland. I'm hoping the new government will perhaps take a role in this through Westminster as well. What we see going on in Scotland is a great example. So the onshore wind sector deal is some clear progress. You can see one of the objectives there. There are a number of objectives in it related to EIA. So how do we streamline approaches to scoping the environmental EIA reports, as they're called in Scotland, using templates and guidance? How do we focus the scope into agreed factors? Many discussions gone on between the key parties there. Some clear progress being made, but we don't quite know what's coming out. So there's a lot of tenterhooks. Is this going to work? Is it not? So we need to see it proven that it's actually effective in practice. And then if it is proven in that sector, how can we rapidly replicate that from that sector into the offshore environment, into other sectors beyond energy, into other countries? I know the Irish are particularly interested in looking at that. So I'm running Scotland's EIA conference in a few weeks, and we have one of the leads of that project. So hopefully we'll know more about that shortly, and the outputs will be out. And then finally, embracing innovation and digital. So we need to modernize the EIA process and bring data in. And it's clear practice is advancing. You can see the IEMA guide there about kind of how do we move EIA to more of an environmental data-led process? How do we build that into the system? So I think perhaps the mania around digital environmental statements being the future of 2015, 2016 has calmed a little, and recognized that if we're going to get to those, we might need to change the regs a bit, because it's very much about structured documents in the concept of paper if it doesn't ask for a paper copy. But also, in order to get to that, you've got to get your ducks in a row of environmental data and everything else managed across the process. But now the discussion is very much about artificial intelligence. That's the big thing. How far and how fast is that going to interact with practice? Is that going to be doing the writing for us? But, AI cannot, necessarily deliver professional judgment that's going to be accepted in a public inquiry. It's not something, that can attend a public inquiry and answer for you. So if you're using AI to kind of summarize and make these kind of conclusions, you need the professionals behind it to be able to back this up. And next May, there's a huge conference going on in Bologna that's very much going to focus on this. And if you're interested, papers can be put in now to the International Association for Impact Assessment. I think a key challenge, though, is are the decision makers as the statutory consultees keeping up on the data side of things, or is it really being led by the consultants and pushing things forward? And then there's also a question around the skills needs of environmental assessment when we look at digital. And just, I think later this week, Rufus might be able to tell us a little bit more. Volume 22 of the Impact Assessment Outlook Journal will be coming out, that I've guest edited, that looks at competence within impact assessment processes. And there's a couple of interesting articles in there on this digital question and digital skills. So that's all from me. Sorry I've run over a little bit, Rufus. Back to you.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Rob. That was fantastic. Lots of potential areas for us to open up the discussions on. So if there's a topic you'd like to hear us discuss, please fire it into the questions. We do have a question coming in. We've spoken quite a lot about environmental impact assessment, so that's project level assessment. Are there any updates or emergent themes on strategic level assessment, so strategic environmental assessment? I'll open that up to you two first, and then I can give some views also. Rob, Josh?
Yeah, happy to jump in. I mean, I think nothing immediate in terms of changes to process that I've seen, but I think there will be an increased focus on strategic environmental assessments. In the energy sector, you've got the new energy systems operator looking at strategic spatial energy plan for the first time, to cover both electricity infrastructure and hydrogen infrastructure. And I think that will need to be accompanied by an SEA. So you'll start to see an increased focus on that earlier in the process. And I think that probably ties in more broadly with where Labour seem to be wanting to go in terms of regional planning more broadly, which again I think will probably bring in the potential need for broader SEAs. That probably create some challenges in terms of some of the topics that we've discussed today, particularly the kind of indirect effect piece. But it's certainly something that I think we will see more of in the future.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree. I mean, Labour obviously when it was last in, there was a much greater emphasis on regional planning. We had regional spatial strategies. There doesn't seem to be quite the definition and structure that we had last time as to what is going to come forward, but there does seem to be that evidence, and Rob is quite right. There are a number of these plans coming forward. So there does seem to be yet again an expectation that SEA will deliver. And I think there's or strategic planning will deliver. I think there's two critical challenges here. One is the timing, which is, we've got 2030 targets for a lot of these things. And, you look at just across the water into the Republic of Ireland, they've got the same thing. It's all over the world. Will we actually be able to get these plans in and have done these strategic environmental assessments in a time that is useful for the bulk of the projects that are coming forward through the consent process? Because with the timings we've got, even if we fail to hit our 2030 targets by 2, 3, 4, 5 years, the build out time for these projects is, not, oh yes, it got consent on Thursday and in 2 months' time we'd built 150 miles of, network cable or undersea cable or whatever. So the build out time is quite a while. So the consent process is now or yesterday or, in the coming years. So I think there's a challenge there, which is unfortunate, but it's just the reality of things. And then I think the other question is, we really need to try and do a very quick, with government, review of strategic environmental assessment. We're on the 2004 guidance. It's 2024. There's been a hell of a lot of practice gone forward. And if we keep doing objective-led assessments, that to an extent, I suppose, are a little bit like outcome reports, but how much have they actually helped in the process? A lot of research, Thomas Fisher has done various bits that shows it's a little bit perhaps more tinkering around the edges on a number of occasions. So how can we really make these processes effective for us? And what can we rapidly learn into these processes? And what can we rapidly feed out from, perhaps the SEA of the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, if it does a great assessment, to practice, so that we're moving on and not just repeating some of the challenges of the past in relation to some of these assessments.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, just to wrap up on that strategic side, Rob and Josh made some really good points. I think it's worth echoing Josh's point about the 2004 guidance is over 20 years old. IEMA has got a strategic impact assessment working group, and we are looking to publish some guidance next year to members on strategic impact assessment. To Josh's point, because we've learned a lot in 20 years of practice, and a lot of things we've learned don't work very well, and other things that we think are working well. And we've got members working in all jurisdictions and sectors. So we're going to try and draw that together to provide some guidance on strategic assessment. Regarding whether the government's going to adopt more of that in the UK, it sounds like they are, but we haven't got the detail on that. I think, from my perspective, another good source for our listeners is the Office of Environmental Protection did a review of environmental assessments, which includes a decent section on a review of SEA. And within that review, we included, which I took part in, as did Josh, we did a stakeholder engagement with public sector, private sector all over the country. And the views were quite clear that the potential benefit of strategic environmental assessment is still recognized. And we all recognize that that's clearly, rationally, the way to deal with many of these issues. Some of the frustrations have been with the actual implementation. And I think that echoes actually the findings on EIA, which were ultimately that the legislation isn't really deficient. It's just that practice and implementation hasn't necessarily delivered everything we'd want it to do. And this links back to Josh's earlier point and the EIA proportionate EIA strategy, which actually some of those barriers are capacity within the various actors, and not just capacity, but also competency, so quality and volume of available people. And then also there's that coordination piece. So Josh is absolutely right. I think IEMA would certainly look to work with government on advancing better strategic environmental assessment, and how can we learn the lessons of the past on doing that. I would say, Josh, that if we have to redraft lots of local plans or bring forward lots of local plans setting the housing issue, which has been set out in the NPPF reforms, which are open for consultation right now and closes on the 24th, there's going to be a big push on either unblocking existing local plans or getting other ones together, and that's going to require a lot of strategic environmental assessment. So I think that's just for the local plans, and that's not including any regional approach, which I would be in favor of. Final point on strategic is that there's a direct link between the strategic and the EIA, and the case that Robert might be able to comment on is a case in point for me would say something like Heathrow, where the project was challenged on the grounds of not, and I'm probably getting this wrong, Robert, but it was studied at length at the national level in terms of a national airport strategy, which then identified potential areas that could be brought forward. But on the critical issue of climate compatibility, the SCA kind of level totally dodged that aspect and said it would be for the individual project to demonstrate its compliance, which in my view is the wrong approach, because effectively you could then spend X number of years and tens of millions of pounds progressing a full sort of capital project to then only get to the court and say, actually, it's fundamentally incompatible with our climate grounds. So to me, that question should be answered at the strategic level first. That was the right way around, I think, in terms of proportionality and sort of efficiency. So happy for Rob or Josh to come back on any of those points, and then I'll take the question.
No, happy to pick that up, Rufus. And I agree, and I think the world has probably moved on a little bit, and you would expect to see that in an SCA now. And I mean, drawing on the coordination piece and analogies from similar areas, I think what we've seen in the offshore wind sector, and particularly with habitats regulation assessment, for example, where initially we've had projects kind of coming forward on a case by case basis and providing pieces of compensation or addressing adverse effects that way. In previous rounds of offshore wind is being addressed through strategic compensation and far more kind of strategic planning at the HRA level, through both the Crown Estate, through their leasings, and then the developers effectively in considering strategic compensation. And I think that's something that can definitely be carried across to SEA in terms of, as you say, thinking about not only the impacts, but how they can actually be addressed and mitigated before you step through to the next process. And I think that probably reads through to a lot of projects in various development sectors where I mean, my focus is on energy, so I immediately go to just some of the areas that are inundated with development at present, and you have various projects doing cumulative effect assessments and then going through the courts, so East Anglia offshore wind farms, for example. And SEA certainly, I think, has a role to play in resolving issues like that at an earlier stage.
Josh?
Yeah, I think I totally agree. It should be involved. It should be trying to engage it. In both cases, however, they are decision support. So that's going to be the challenge is, would the government ultimately look at something like an airport strategy and say expansion of our airports isn't compatible, therefore we're not going to put that into the economy? Or despite an SEA perhaps having looked at it and said, well, this is going to be incredibly challenging and it's entirely reliant on sustainable aviation fuel coming forward and actually working, which we can't crystal ball say it will or it won't at the moment, it can still adopt a plan that allows that to move forward. And as Rob was saying in relation to the Finch case, as long as the project has looked at the risks and they're there on an EIA grounds and they meet the procedure, then it wouldn't be challenged on EIA grounds. That doesn't mean, and I guess this is where perhaps more legal challenge is going to come, is challenges against, incompatibility with, the Climate Act and the targets that we have in relation to those areas. So I think it's going to get more challenging for these big projects, and we are increasingly at or beyond the point where we should have been making these decisions. So they do need to be tackled, they do need to be exposed, they do need to be discussed, and the public needs to be engaged, which is a key thing that Rob brought out of the Finch and more recent cases.
Thank you, Josh and Rob. Okay, we've got another question here. Has the EIA process incorporated the sustainability of projects? So I'll expand on that a little bit. I know that we do, for example, on the strategic level, a sustainability appraisal, which will incorporate the requirements under the strategic environmental assessment. That's quite common. And I've seen projects, for example, in Denmark, where they've looked at how do we integrate sustainable development goals into EIA. But in terms of what's happening at the moment in the UK and also what's potentially coming forward, have you seen, either of you, any sort of efforts to align maybe some of the stuff around corporate social responsibility, ESG, sustainable development goals, anything in the wider sustainability field explicitly into the EIA process?
Yes and no from my side. So I've seen projects doing it, and I've seen projects doing it quite comprehensively. Linkage across to EIA is perhaps a little bit more case by case. And I think that's because EIA has a job to do, and it's not necessarily required to cover that. So it's going to be part of the mix, but how far it gets brought into the EIA process and formalized. So I know the Thames Tideway project did a lot in relation to the sustainable development goals and setting those as ambitions as part of its environmental objectives and its wider sustainability objectives. And they had some connection, obviously, across to the EIA, but almost they were more core to the project because they had to carry through to delivery and then be checked, whereas the EIA, is a certain tool at a certain time. The Environment Agency has some sustainable development goal tools that it runs alongside its project appraisals, and I'm sure there are other corporates who do a large amount that will also link in. Some of the water companies I know have linked their corporate responsibility into their projects and have some targets. How far they tie across to the EIA process, I don't think, well, there's not a huge amount of guidance in relation to it. There's a little bit of IA fast tips, two-sided on sustainable development goals and linking into those. But I'd say sustainability has crept into EIA over time in terms of some of the more social and economic kind of sections that are perhaps appearing in some of our chapters. But we haven't really kind of fully gone across to fully explore all the social side and fully link into things that might be then reported as ESG type numbers and those type of things. How far we really need to go in practice, I think, is debatable. I think it's important for the professionals involved to know those links across the project so that they can engage and bring their skills when they're there, even if they then aren't necessarily being formally written up and put into the scope of the EIA reports or environmental statements. That'd be my take on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Rob, any thoughts?
No, I think my experience sounds similar to Josh, that effectively what you're seeing is developers baking in these benefits as part of the project and then assessing them. So you're if it's a housing development that is I don't know, car free or provide some other forms of benefits, that will just be baked in as part of the assessment. I think where you might start to see some of the sustainability issues assessed more and more as a result of Finch is that example I touched on earlier, where you might have a project which leads to the decarbonisation of industry elsewhere, and dealing with that as a potential indirect effect or downstream effect of the project may creep in to environmental statements more. But I think for a lot of projects, that's already being assessed as part of the benefit. Anyway, so yeah, I think my experience kind of mirrors Josh's there.
Yeah, just to throw in my comments on top of that, I think that EIA implicitly covers many aspects of sustainability. It considers biodiversity, it considers climate, it considers heritage. You know, a good one will consider social and health assessments if they're pertinent, but it's not necessarily explicit in the language of saying, you know, this is or isn't. And if you're looking at, say, the NPPF and looking about in the round in the planning balance whether something is or isn't sustainable development, they'll be drawing heavily on the content of the EIA to inform their reasoning and their thinking. But I don't think it's, you know, explicitly well reported the direct link between the EIA and some sort of conclusion on sustainability. And I think that's often contained in multiple documents, as Rob and Josh said. It could be in the overarching design of the buildings, where they've maybe lent into some certification around sustainability, whether they've implemented any sort of circular economy approaches or whatever. They'd be part of the wider development and would go outside of just the EIA and include the design and access statement, the planning statement, lots of other, the EMS of the corporate body, and all sorts of things. So sustainability is a much wider and all pervasive sort of concept. But I do think that EIA contributes significantly to improving the sustainability of projects and also helping you to come to a conclusion on the sustainability of project. Josh?
Just one final thought perhaps on that is, I think we are now seeing in certain communities that are perhaps now being asked to, you know, to host power lines, that are perhaps being asked to host onshore or solar farms and those kind of things. We're seeing more questions raised about the fair transition. And I think there's a wider conversation to have in society of, you know, kind of the fair transition on a global basis is very different to the fair transition and the pains felt on a more local basis. So, you know, having a solar farm near you in the area that I live in, Lincolnshire, yes, can impinge on issues, but it's not quite the same as if you're a Pacific Islands community that is looking at the very reality of losing your entire country in the coming years. But there are these issues that are being raised. There are these, you know, just transition questions being raised. There is more pressure, I think, that's going to come from communities, particularly now as we're looking at perhaps, you know, a revival of onshore wind, and we're seeing a lot of solar, very large solar projects, you know, now being consented by the new government that perhaps have been held up by the previous one. So I think what really needs to come from the government is there's a lot of different issues. And there's a lot of different issues in play in sustainability. And there's a certain degree that we have to prioritise some of these. So NPF4 in Scotland, I think, does quite a good job of highlighting the joint climate and biodiversity crises, and therefore has changed a bit of the conversation up in Scotland in relation to landscape and visual impacts versus climate and perhaps biodiversity priority. And we need to see how that plays out in other areas. And then in Northern Ireland, we frankly need to get in the game and have those environmental priorities actually updated into the planning policy system that you see in England, Wales and Scotland. So we will see this continuously around, and we see this globally as well. You and me, Rufus, were at an international conference in Dublin earlier this year, and lots of talk about just the volume of sustainable transition infrastructure needed, the time frame to get it in being very, very short, and therefore a desire to streamline these assessment processes, but at the same time recognizing that communities are more and more concerned and connected and raising sustainability challenges. So an increasing desire to engage at the same time as we've got less time to do it, and perhaps a desire for these tools to be more efficient is going to be a real, or is already a real challenge in practice.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Josh. Okay, we've got some burning questions coming in. We've got a couple on EORs, which for those aren't dialed into that, the proposals in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act brought in the powers to revoke EIA and SCA in England, I want to say, Robert, and replace them with environmental outcome reports. A lot of uncertainty about whether they will come forward. If they do come forward, what exact shape they'll have. There hasn't been any publication following the consultation on EORs. And there was a lot of, as a devolved matter, there was a lot of uncertainty around whether Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland would follow EORs. So a lot of uncertainty there. So the three questions, I'll read all three of them out and then I'll ask you your views. Any further detail on the likelihood and timescales of moving to EORs? Any idea when EOR will become live? And then the third one, has a new government approached IEMA for advice or guidance regarding the future of EIA or EORs? So, Josh, Rob, either of you like to give some views?
And happy to pick up in the first instance. I mean, the legislation is there to allow for this to come forward, but it's fairly bare bones. So that was introduced in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which came into force last year, but effectively leaves, as the consultation kind of identified, leaves all of this to be dealt with through subordinate legislation and through subsequent regulations. I'm not aware of a timeline for those coming forward at present, and I think whilst kind of Labour have put growth and planning reform pretty much front and centre of their agenda in terms of energising the economy and bringing development forward, I'm not sure this is an area they're necessarily hugely focused on from everything I've heard at the moment. I think it's what they're looking at is getting things done quicker. And I'm not sure that kind of the wide-ranging changes they need to bring in through regulation is necessarily top of their agenda at the moment.
Thanks, Rob. Josh?
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with Rob. I mean, pre-election, I think it was kind of January time. What was the Department for Levelling Up at the time? Obviously now is Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government again. Indicated that they didn't expect to kind of be bringing forward draft regs this year, and obviously the kind of silent inference within that was we'll also have to see what happens with the general election. Obviously, we got quite a profound change coming out of that. So I think Rob's right. You know, Labour front and centre, growth, planning reform was right there, and then in those first few weeks was right there. And as you say, Rufus, the NPPF consultation coming to an end at the moment. So it doesn't seem to be a priority. There was a letter out to nature conservation parties that kind of indicated what they would prioritise is, or they would only move forward with these types of reforms if they felt that they were genuinely going to improve the environment and improve the process. Whilst EOR wasn't directly referenced there, we know from a number of parties who responded to that consultation in terms of the concept of EORs back in spring 2023 now, I think it was, that there were challenges in relation to that process. So we still haven't seen the formal response from the government in relation to that consultation process. I've tried to do some engagement, both I know IEMA has, I've also been working with some senior professionals to try and offer engagement in relation to the government. I think Rob's right, the priority seems to be elsewhere at the moment, so we haven't had a huge amount come back from that. I believe one of the lead people who was working on it for the Ministry of Housing and Communities and Local Government has moved on as well. So, you know, that will obviously be a challenge in terms of resourcing if one of their leading thinkers around this has moved on. I guess the final thing to say is it's not just the regs. We would need really quite comprehensive guidance about these specified environmental outcomes. The statutory consultees would need to put quite a bit of time into that. Pre-election, I did have some conversations with some colleagues, some staff in DEFRA who were looking into these issues and beginning to poke and prod them. So there was work at that point going on. It's very unclear as to whether that work has been shelved or whether that is just going on in the background and there isn't obvious engagement going on. I don't know, Rufus, if you've seen any wider engagement through your IEMA role.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I think I'd echo most of that. There hasn't been any formal engagement with IEMA in recent times. We've obviously been engaging through public consultations since 2020 on the various planning reforms and consultations, and IEMA has put in a lot of feedback to government through those processes. And there was some engagement with the EOR team around a year ago, etc., but nothing since sort of the hiatus of a general election. I think that what's clear to most people who actually follow environmental impact assessment in practice is that if the ultimate goal is speeding things up and getting projects built, changing legislation that we've had for 30 years, is not going to speed it up. It's going to slow it down. It'll introduce delays for multiple reasons. Delays in bringing forward the legislation, then consulting on it, then publishing it. Then there'd have to be a transposition, the lead-in time. So projects in the old system, not to a certain date, etc., would have to go forward. Then you'd have two systems running side by side, depending on the age of the project in the planning system. Then you'd have to have the guidance around that. Then you'd start getting case law. So all of that is going to take time and effort that could be spent on actually just dealing with some of the more concrete blockers in the existing system. And I think ultimately that was the conclusion of the OEP, which consulted widely and that IEMA fed into, which is that the primary legislation is not actually the problem. The problem lies elsewhere around capacity issues, lack of guidance in specific areas, lack of strategic interventions in other areas, and also, and close your ears, Robert, a legalistic system, which is, leading to a lot of defensive drafting, which I don't like pointing fingers, because there's so many parties involved. There's developers, there's planners, there's EIAs, there's statutory bodies, there is lawyers, and everyone's contributing to, proportionality issues. But if you do ask around, most people say there is a legal fear element of defensive drafting, of, don't leave anything out, don't leave any, prospect of challenge. More experienced legal practitioners will tell you that the more you write, actually, the more you can be challenged on. And that actually, if you write confidently and with expertise, you can be proportionate and not increase your legal risk. But that requires confidence. Going back to Josh's earlier point, confidence comes with experience, and we're lacking capacity and experience for the various reasons set out. Yeah, go for it, Josh.
Just one final point back on the EOR side, or two final points. So progress, if it were to be made, would almost certainly be England only, and I guess UK reserved matters. The devolved administrations didn't look to be kind of jumping all over this. Scotland, as far as I understand, had pretty much responded and said, well, we're pretty satisfied with what we've got. Northern Ireland has its own priorities of big issues on the environment around Lough Neagh, around issues because it has the border with the Republic and therefore transboundary issues to think about. So I think it would be very surprising if Northern Ireland were to prioritise such change. I get the impression Wales isn't necessarily as negative towards the idea as the other two, but definitely wants England to jump first and see if it works before it would follow. So I think you would get a kind of, if it were to be implemented, and it seems a big if now, or it's maybe only comes back if we get a change of government in the future, it would likely be a cascade slowly out across the country. I think the other thing that we need to be aware of, particularly for the English Town and Country Planning regs, is I believe Laura actually deleted section 76A, which gave the government power, I think it was 76A anyway, that gave the government power to amend the Town and Country Planning EIA regs. So there is a possible issue that if we do want to improve EIA quickly, we are going to need some primary legislation somewhere to just flick that switch the other way around. I think there's an argument that some of the Brexit legislation gives us powers to continue to amend and edit things. I don't know if Rob's got any perspective on that, but the government arguably has been slightly hamstrung in terms of progressing legislative change on EIA within the planning system, at least.
Josh, if I can, we've only got 2 minutes left. I just want to end on a positive note. So echoing on the stuff you mentioned about the onshore wind sector deal in Scotland, there are ongoing efforts with Project Speed within the Planning Inspectorate, and they are looking to bring out sort of industry evidence-based guidance on scoping. I think solar's coming forward, although not in the public domain yet. And the project you mentioned before around offshore wind has continued. I'm still working on that. So it's called the Offshore Wind Evidence and Knowledge Hub. And we're now bringing forward over the next coming months evidence notes on particular topics within offshore wind, which will be looking to set proportionate scopes, standardized mitigation, standardized conditions, etc. Again, to your point, Josh, we've got 76 published offshore wind environmental statements. And what we're doing is actually analysing that data and saying, we don't need to start from scratch. There are clear trends and evidence now that's been built up over time, including monitoring data, that can say with confidence, these are non-issues, or this issue is mitigatable. And there's, you know, really good evidence now that there are conditions and mitigations that could be relied upon to you know, reduce the potential for significant adverse effects. So there is work going on in those areas, but we've run out of time. So I'll leave you on that on tenterhooks. If you want more of this, on the 10th of December, we have the Waterfront EIA conference. Go to the Waterfront website and book your place. Leaves me to thank Rob and Josh for your time today. Thank our listeners, which peaked at around 100 people. This has been recorded. Thank you so much, Josh, Robert. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone else, and see you again soon.
Thank you all.